Hi guys! Welcome to day 2 of our Thriving as an Empath and Highly Sensitive Person challenge. Today is going to be a really fun day. So we're going to talk a little bit about the science of empathy. Hang on one second. Let me just move this. There we go. Okay, great. So we're going to talk a little bit about the science of empathy. And if you haven't watched the day 1 video, definitely go back and do that, because I think it'll set a nice foundation so that you can get a better understanding or a clearer understanding of kind of what is empathy, what is an empath, what is a highly sensitive person. I went through some books that are really important to me that were really helpful in kind of understanding what this is and what this kind of means as a trait or quality. So that would be really important to review. And today I wanted to talk just a little bit about the science of empathy. So this is something that's always been really interesting to me. So throughout my graduate school training, I was even really interested in empathy and better understanding what that trait was like and what are people like who have high levels of empathy, or how does empathy as an experience relate to different types of behaviors in people's lives. So this was something that was always really interesting to me. Also, in particular, sort of in a medical context, sort of how empathy relates to health behaviors, how empathy plays a role in a medical communication between patient and provider. So those things were always super interesting to me, just kind of naturally. So there's a couple components that I want to talk about specifically, because empathy is a huge topic. So I could be here like all night going through different research on empathy. It's been studied widely in a variety of different contexts for a long time. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about empathy is that they can sometimes break it down into different components, so that it's not sort of one universal thing, but really has different elements, or can have different elements, and often it's studied that way. So one of the psychological assessments or self-report questionnaires that's used is called the interpersonal reactivity index. So this is a measure that's used in different studies, social science research often, to measure empathy. It's been around for a long time. There are other things that measure empathy, certainly. There's many other scales, right? But this is just one. I actually used it in my dissertation, so this is why I know a little bit about it. But it measures different components of empathy. So there's kind of two larger buckets that we break empathy down into. So we break it down into this sort of cognitive kind of perspective taking. Can I take the perspective of another person? Can I kind of intellectually, psychologically, mentally understand and appreciate what it might be like for that person, and can I take their perspective? Okay, so that's sort of one bucket, right? And then the other bucket, larger umbrella that we kind of break things down into, is really the emotional or affective empathy piece, right? That feeling, the feeling that another might be experiencing. So being able to connect with the emotion that another person might be experiencing or is experiencing in a particular situation. So that's kind of the breakdown, are those two areas. So the interpersonal reactivity index measures a couple different things. It measures perspective taking, so that kind of cognitive, intellectual sort of, can I take the perspective of another person piece. It also measures empathic concern, which is sort of this emotional, affective, feeling the kind of empathy for someone, feeling the emotions of someone. And us as empaths, right, we tend to not only feel the emotions of others intensely, but we tend to feel our own emotions really intensely, right? So I often kind of wonder how that impacts these things. But anyway, so it measures empathic concern. It also has these two other scales that are kind of interesting. One is fantasy. So how easily can you kind of get lost in the characters on a TV show or a movie or a book? Or in your imagination, you know, how easily is it for you to kind of go along or go into a story, connect with characters, really get lost in your imagination and kind of that daydreaming piece. It's a weird name for the scale. I don't love the name for fantasy, but I thought I always thought that was kind of a unique thing to sort of measure how likely people are, and also likely people are to do that, and then measuring it kind of as a larger component of empathy, which is interesting. The last one of the subscales is about personal distress. So this one really measures people's experience of feeling uneasy, maybe anxious, uncomfortable in particularly tense or high emotion situations, or when there's another person who's really distressed. How do you experience that sort of personal distress in like a high stress, high stimulation, high impact kind of situation? Maybe it's a conflict, maybe it's a group of other people having a really tense conversation at like a dinner, but what is your level of personal distress? Which kind of takes it up a notch from maybe just experiencing kind of how people may be, but really experiencing your own distress in those types of situations. So that's one of the scales that I think is kind of interesting to talk about. It's just the only one I'm going to highlight today, but there are others certainly. But I do tend to think of empathy sort of in that way, that it's broken down in the literature for this kind of cognitive piece and then this kind of emotional piece. And some of us are more likely to be in different parts of that, right? Some of us feel kind of both intensely. And so I mentioned earlier that in my dissertation I actually measured empathy. And one of the things that I looked at in my dissertation was if empathy plays a role in how people engage in health behaviors. So also certainly interested in what makes people want to be healthier or actually engage in intentional health behaviors, right? Things that will keep them healthy, things that will prevent illness, things that will keep them vital and healthy. So one of the things that I found, it was broader than that, but that's one piece of it. So what I found actually was that people who are more empathic are more likely to engage in health behaviors. And not just the intention of engaging in health behaviors, but actual health behaviors. So exercise, eating well, taking care of themselves, going for checkups, sleeping, prioritizing these sort of healthy living approaches. So people who are more empathic are more likely to do that. So that's interesting, right? It was predictive of engaging in health behaviors. So then you start to think about, like, well, why is that, right? So some of the things that I looked into were really health communication messages and what plays a role in health communication messages actually landing for people, right? And kind of taking them in. So is it that, and these are just some things that I kind of thought about, don't have clear answers, right? But like, are people who are empathic more likely to pay attention to health communication messages? Are they more likely to connect with the illness experience of someone else and not want that for themselves, right? Are they able to then take steps to prevent that? Are they more easily able to connect with just suffering in general and then want to avoid that even in a medical health related way for themselves? Not totally sure on that, but those were some of the things that I kind of hypothesized that might drive that predictive quality there, so that if you're more empathic, you're more likely to engage in health behaviors. But kind of why, right? And unpack that a little bit. Hi Anna. Okay, couldn't see who that was. Welcome. So that's just something kind of an interesting sort of tidbit that is really interesting to me, at least, because I studied it for a while. But to try to really learn more about that, right? And how does this sort of quality of empathy kind of drive different behaviors? Or what are we more likely or less likely to do? So one of the other things that I want to talk about just a little is something that I kind of listed out this morning in the post for today, is about the mirror neuron system. So if you're looking at any empathy research anywhere, and they're talking about the neurological component of that, or the neuroscience piece of empathy, you will come across, undoubtedly, the mirror neuron system or some sort of description of this, right? So in a nutshell, in a very simplified way, there are areas in your brain, groups of cells, parts of your brain that are activated when you see someone else in pain. So there's similar areas that are activated as if you are experiencing pain or whatever that emotion might be that the other person is experiencing. So you're sort of mirroring what's happening for them. So you are not experiencing the pain, but you are seeing someone that maybe you care about in pain. And as we measure brain functioning, it's often like a functional MRI, I think is usually how they do it. They're lighting up and having activation in areas of the brain that are similar to what would be activated if they themselves were experiencing the pain. Does that make sense? Hope that makes sense. So I was reading this article actually this morning that was kind of clarifying this a little bit. And so there's lots of regions in your brain that may activate or kind of light up on testing when you're in pain. So they were referring to this as like the pain matrix, right? There's lots of different parts of it. There's sort of an emotional part, there's a sensory part, there's kind of lots of different areas that are activated when you are in pain. And so what they did was that they had people who, loved ones of the experimenters, or the people who were part of the experiment, they had loved ones experience pain, right? So you're obviously connected to the person who you're seeing, right? So that person would be experiencing pain, and then they were measuring what happens in your brain when you see this person that you care about in pain. So it was interesting because they sort of were able to drill down to see that it's not the whole pain matrix that lights up. It's not everything that lights up and activates as if you were in pain. But the parts that do tend to be the parts that are more emotional, the more affective, the more kind of emotionally driven pieces that are activated when you might be experiencing pain. So that's what's activated more so, that emotional piece, when you see someone else in pain. And the sensory area, which would also be activated when you yourself are experiencing pain, is not as activated when you're seeing someone else in pain. So that's kind of interesting, right? It's like flagging this emotional piece and not as much the sensory, because you're not physically experiencing that, which is super interesting, right? I was kind of curious, like, if you were able to kind of repeat that with people who were really empathic or identify as empaths or really quite easily connect with the experience of others, would they also light up more areas, right? Would they also have more intense sensory experiences where they were sort of feeling the pain of other people or pain of a loved one, right? So anyway, just things I was thinking about as I was reading that. But really, if anybody has any sort of interest, the empathy literature is really, really fascinating. There's lots of neat things that people have done just throughout the years. I mean, 50, 60 years of really interesting literature on the topic of empathy and kind of how that impacts relationships, how that impacts professional life, how it impacts the patient-provider relationship, how that impacts the therapist-patient relationship, just how it impacts you when you're working with others. Or just interacting with others. So many things, how it correlates with different personality types, how that changes different behaviors. So there's a really rich literature base out there on empathy. So it's a really interesting thing to kind of study and look more into. So if you guys are interested, I can try to come up with some books that might be neat for that. But really, I just wanted to touch on that kind of science piece of empathy, because I wouldn't want to miss that, because there's actually a lot of research that's been done and continues to evolve. Super interesting area. And then we're going to go more into like the woo-woo stuff for other parts of the week. So we're going to talk about crystals and how to really use crystals to help you as an empath. We'll talk about crystals for grounding practices, meditation, visualizations, those kinds of things. So we'll move more into like the kind of energetic space. But I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you guys have questions or there's things that you want to clarify. But I think some of the take-home messages are like, there are different components of empathy. There's this sort of cognitive, intellectual, psychological kind of perspective taking. I'm taking the perspective of another, or I'm imagining and thinking about how they might perceive a situation. And then there's this more emotional, affective piece, right? I'm feeling what the other person is feeling or think they might be feeling. So that's the kind of two main sort of buckets as empathy is studied. And then we talked a little bit about connecting with sort of fantasy characters or characters in books or TV or movies and those kind of things and how easily that happens for people. So just kind of interesting things to think about where you are in this and what kind of characterizes your particular kind of flavor of empathy that you have. But yeah, let me know, comment, let me know when you're watching, or if there's something that's really interesting to you, or something that you didn't know, maybe you know all this already, I don't know. But yeah, so just comment and let me know what you think. All right, well have a good night, and I will see you guys tomorrow.